September 18, 1944, Ulithi Atoll, Caroline Islands. Staff Sergeant Frank Pops Morrison was 42 years old, which made him ancient by military standards. Most mechanics in the Pacific were kids in their early 20s, fresh-faced, full of energy, raised on cars and radios and eager to prove themselves. Morrison was old enough to be their father, had fought in World War I, and moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose body had been objecting to manual labor for the past decade. The younger mechanics called him Pops, sometimes to his face, more often behind his back. They meant it affectionately, mostly. But there was condescension in it too, the sense that Morrison was past his prime, kept around because the military needed every warm body but not really expected to contribute much beyond routine maintenance. Morrison knew what they thought. He'd heard the whispered comments. The old man can barely lift an engine block. Should have retired years ago. Dead weight on any field operation. He didn't argue. Let them think what they wanted. He'd learned long ago that proving yourself through words was pointless. You proved yourself through work, through results, through being there when things went to hell and everyone else was too young or too scared to know what to do. Today, things were about to go to hell. The briefing took place at 1400 hours in a tent that smelled like mildew and aviation fuel. 12 men sat on folding chairs facing a map of the Philippine Sea. Morrison sat in the back, as usual, listening as Major William Strand laid out the mission. Gentlemen, 6 days ago, a B-24 went down approximately 40 miles north of Japanese-held Yap Island. The crew, 10 men, survived the crash and managed to reach a small, uninhabited island. They've been transmitting distress signals via emergency radio. We're going to get them out. Strand pointed to the map. The island is here, 12 miles from the nearest Japanese garrison. We'll use a PBY Catalina for extraction. Flight time from Ulithi, 90 minutes. We land in the lagoon, pick up the crew, and return before the Japanese realize we're there. What's the complication? Lieutenant James Hartley asked. Hartley was 26, a pilot with 73 combat hours and the confidence of someone who'd survived long enough to think he was invincible. Weather, Strand said. Meteorology reports a tropical storm forming east of the Philippines. Current track suggests it'll pass north of our position, but conditions will deteriorate. We launch at 600 tomorrow. If the weather holds, we're good. If it doesn't, things get complicated. How complicated? Another pilot asked. Complicated enough that I'm sending a mechanic along. If we have to emergency land and ride out weather, I want someone who can keep the PBY operational. Everyone turned to look at Morrison. He felt the weight of their skepticism. 12 younger men wondering why command was sending the old guy instead of literally anyone else who could move faster, work harder, and probably contribute more. Morrison said nothing. He'd volunteered for this mission because 10 men were stranded and someone needed to get them out. Simple as that. His age was irrelevant. His capabilities would speak for themselves, or they wouldn't, and he'd fail, and the younger men's skepticism would be validated. Either way, they'd know by tomorrow. The PBY Catalina lifted off from Ulithi at 6:05 hours on September 19. Morrison sat in the waist section surrounded by rescue supplies, water, rations, medical kits, and a toolbox containing everything he might need to keep the aircraft flying. The flight was smooth initially, clear skies, light winds, visibility unlimited. By 7:15, conditions had changed. Clouds built on the horizon. Wind speeds increased. The tropical storm that meteorology had predicted would pass north was now tracking west, directly toward their position. At 7:42, they spotted the island, a kidney-shaped piece of coral and sand barely a quarter-mile long. The B-24 crew was visible on the beach, waving frantically as the Catalina descended toward the lagoon. The landing was textbook. Pilot Lieutenant Hartley brought the PBY down gently, the hull kissing water, spray washing over the cockpit windows. They taxied toward shore. The rescue took 12 minutes. The B-24 crew waded out to the Catalina, hauling themselves through the waste hatch while Morrison helped pull them aboard. They were sunburned, dehydrated, grateful, and terrified of the weather building on the horizon. "We need to leave now," one of them said. "That storm's getting worse." Hartley agreed. He powered up the engines for takeoff. The Catalina accelerated across the lagoon, lifting spray, building speed. And then the starboard engine coughed, sputtered, and died. Hartley cut power immediately. The Catalina settled back onto the water, momentum bleeding off. In the sudden quiet, everyone heard the wind picking up, saw the clouds darkening, felt the first drops of rain beginning to fall. "What happened?" Hartley demanded over the intercom. Morrison was already moving toward the starboard engine nacelle, accessing the maintenance panel. He examined the engine visually, checked fuel lines, inspected the ignition system. 5 minutes of diagnosis revealed the problem. A fuel pump drive coupling had fractured. The engine wasn't getting fuel. Without fuel, it wouldn't run. And without both engines, the overloaded Catalina couldn't take off. Morrison climbed back into the fuselage and found Hartley staring at him. "Can you fix it?" the pilot asked. "Not quickly. The coupling needs to be replaced. That's a 3-hour job under ideal conditions. These aren't ideal conditions. So we're stuck." "We're stuck." Hartley looked at the weather building around them. Rain was falling steadily now. Wind was gusting to 20 knots. The tropical storm was no longer theoretical, it was here, and it was strengthening. "How bad is this going to get?" one of the B-24 crew members asked. Morrison had seen tropical storms before. He'd been stationed in the Philippines in 1918, had lived through a typhoon that killed 300 people. He knew what was coming. "Bad," he said quietly. "Very bad. This isn't a storm we can ride out in the aircraft. We need to get to land and find shelter." "The island's barely above sea level," Hartley said. "Storm surge will wash over it." "Then we build something." "Build what? Out of what?" Morrison looked around the PBY's interior. The aluminum hull, the fabric control surfaces, the supplies they'd brought for rescue. Then he looked at the jungle visible through the waste hatch, trees, vines, coral outcroppings. "We build a shelter that can survive winds and storm surge. Something low, aerodynamic, anchored to coral. We have tools, we have materials, and we have 6 hours before conditions get lethal." The younger men stared at him like he'd lost his mind. "You want to build a storm shelter," Hartley said, "on a coral island in 6 hours, during a typhoon." "I want to not die," Morrison replied. "Building shelter gives us a better chance than staying in an aircraft that'll break apart when winds hit 60 knots. That's insane. That's survival." Hartley looked around at the other men, 19 faces, some skeptical, some terrified, all looking to him for leadership. He was the ranking officer. The decision was his. But he was also 26 years old and had never experienced a Pacific typhoon. Morrison was 42 and had survived one. "What do you need?" Hartley asked finally. "Everyone working, and nobody questioning whether this is stupid until after we're alive tomorrow." For the next 6 hours, 19 men would follow the orders of a mechanic they dismissed as dead weight, building a shelter using principles he'd learned during a storm 26 years earlier, betting their lives on a plan that sounded insane, but might be the only thing that could save them. The storm was coming, and Pops Morrison, the old man, the has-been, the guy who could barely lift an engine block, was about to prove that experience mattered more than youth when survival depended on knowing exactly how things broke and exactly what it took to keep them together. Chapter 2, The Stupid Plan. Morrison waded ashore with the toolbox and started surveying the island. It was depressingly small, 300 yards long, 150 yards wide at its widest point, mostly sand and coral with patches of scrub vegetation, and a handful of palm trees bent by years of prevailing winds. The highest point was maybe 8 feet above sea level. When storm surge hit, most of the island would be underwater. They couldn't stay on the beach. They couldn't stay in the PBY. They needed something that could survive winds exceeding 100 mph and water levels rising 6 feet or more. Morrison's plan was based on principles he'd learned the hard way in 1918. Typhoon shelters had to be low, wind velocity increased with height, so staying close to the ground reduced force exposure. They had to be aerodynamic. Rounded shapes deflected wind better than flat surfaces. They had to be anchored. Storm surge would try to float anything not tied down. And they had to drain. Water accumulation created structural stress. He sketched the design in sand. A semi-cylindrical shelter built into a coral outcropping, using the PBY's fabric control surfaces as waterproof covering, supported by a frame made from palm tree trunks, anchored with aircraft cable tied to coral formations, and oriented to present minimum profile to wind direction. Lieutenant Hartley looked at the sketch. You want to build an underground bunker covered with airplane fabric. Essentially, yes. In 6 hours. In 5, actually. The storm will make the last hour unworkable. This is the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Do you have a better plan? Hartley didn't. Nobody did. The B-24 crew had survived 6 days because they'd been lucky with weather. Luck was running out. They needed engineering, not luck. Morrison divided the 19 men into teams. 5 would excavate the coral outcropping, digging a trench 3 feet deep and 20 feet long. 8 would cut palm trees and prepare them as structural supports. 4 would strip fabric from the PBY's control surfaces and ailerons. 2 would scavenge aircraft cable and prepare anchor points. The work began at 8:30 hours. By 900, rain was falling steadily and wind gusted to 30 knots. By 9:30, conditions had deteriorated enough that working was difficult. By 1000, it was dangerous. The younger men struggled with the physical labor. Digging through coral was brutal. Sharp edges cut hands. Progress was measured in inches. Cutting palm trees required saws that dulled quickly. Stripping fabric from the PBY meant working in wind and rain that made every task twice as hard. Morrison worked alongside them, moving slower but more efficiently. He'd been doing manual labor for 40 years. He knew how to pace himself, how to use leverage instead of strength, how to work smart when working hard was impossible. At 11:15, one of the B-24 crew members, a kid named Danny Chen, approached Morrison with a problem. "Sarge, the fabric's tearing when we try to remove it. The wind's pulling it apart." Morrison examined the damage. The control surface fabric was held by dozens of small rivets. Removing them carefully took time they didn't have, but ripping the fabric destroyed the material they needed for shelter covering. "Stop removing it," Morrison said. "Cut the entire control surface free with the fabric attached. We'll use the aluminum frame as part of the shelter structure." "That's going to add weight." "Weight is good. Weight resists storm surge. Do it." By 1200, the shelter was taking shape. The trench had been excavated 18 inches deep, less than Morrison wanted, but coral was fighting them. Palm tree supports were in place, lashed together with aircraft cable. The PBY's fabric-covered ailerons were being positioned as roof panels. Then the real problem started. At 12:15, the wind shifted direction. Morrison's shelter design had assumed wind from the east. Now it was coming from the southeast, which meant the shelter's aerodynamic profile was wrong. They needed to reorient everything, dig a new trench, reposition supports, change anchor points. "We don't have time," Hartley said. "Storm's hitting in 4 hours." "Then we work faster." At 12:30, one of the anchor points failed. The coral formation they'd been using to secure aircraft cable had fractured under tension. The cable whipped free, nearly hitting two men. They needed new anchor points, which meant finding different coral outcroppings and re-rigging the entire anchoring system. At 1300, they ran out of usable aircraft cable. Morrison had calculated they'd need 200 feet. They'd used 220. The remaining cable was corroded or frayed, unsafe for anchor duty. Morrison improvised. He stripped electrical wire from the PBY's wing section, braided it into makeshift rope, and used that to supplement the anchoring system. It was weaker than aircraft cable, but properly distributed across multiple anchor points. It might hold. By 1400, the shelter was approximately 70% complete. They had structure, they had covering, they had anchoring, but the fabric roof wasn't fully secured, the drainage system wasn't finished, and the entrance needed reinforcement. And the storm was getting worse. Wind speeds had increased to 45 knots. Rain was horizontal. Visibility had dropped to less than 50 yards. Working was becoming impossible. Men were being knocked down by gusts. Equipment was being blown away, and the rising water had already covered portions of the beach. At 1430, Hartley approached Morrison. The pilot's face was cut from flying debris, his uniform soaked, his expression somewhere between determined and terrified. "Pops, we're not going to finish in time." Morrison looked at the shelter, calculating what was essential and what could be sacrificed. "We finished the entrance reinforcement and the primary anchor points. Everything else is nice to have. And if the shelter fails?" "Then we tried, but I've built storm shelters before. This one will hold if we secure it properly." "You built storm shelters 26 years ago. Physics hasn't changed." For the next hour, 19 men focused on the critical tasks, reinforcing the entrance with a makeshift door made from the PBY's access hatch, securing the fabric roof with doubled anchor points, and testing every cable connection under load. At 1530, Morrison called everyone to the shelter. "Get inside. Storm surge is coming." The men crawled into the semi-cylindrical structure that barely looked like it could withstand a stiff breeze, let alone a typhoon. 19 bodies crammed into a space designed for maybe 12, all of them soaked, exhausted, and silently wondering if the old mechanic's stupid plan was going to get them killed. Morrison was the last one in. He sealed the entrance hatch, checked the anchor points one final time from inside, and settled into the only remaining space, right next to the door, where water would enter first if the seals failed. Outside, the wind was hitting 60 knots. Inside, men were praying, cursing, and regretting every decision that had brought them to this moment. And Pops Morrison, the dead weight, the has-been, the old man who couldn't lift an engine block, sat calmly in the dark, listening to the storm build, confident that his stupid plan would work because he'd calculated every force, anticipated every failure mode, and built redundancy into every critical system. The storm would test it soon. Chapter 3, The Storm Hits. At 1600 hours, the typhoon arrived with the force of a freight train hitting a wall. Wind speeds went from 60 knots to 90 in minutes. The sound was overwhelming, a continuous roar punctuated by crashes as debris impacted the shelter, as waves surged over the island, as the storm tested every structural decision Morrison had made in the 5 hours of construction. Inside the shelter, darkness was absolute. Someone had a flashlight, but its batteries were dying, giving just enough light to see 19 terrified faces pressed together in a space that now felt claustrophobic and far too vulnerable. Water began seeping through the entrance seal at 1612. Morrison had expected this. He'd built a drainage channel along the shelter floor that directed water toward the rear exit, a small opening that allowed water to flow through rather than accumulate. The system worked, barely. Water came in, flowed along the channel, drained out. The shelter interior stayed wet but not flooded. At 16:25, one of the anchor points failed. The cable snapped with a sound like a gunshot, and the fabric roof shifted violently. Men shouted in panic, expecting the entire structure to collapse. Morrison stayed calm. "That was the southeast anchor. We have 4 others holding. It's fine." "It's not fine," someone yelled. "We're going to die in here. We're going to survive in here if everyone stays calm and trusts the structure." At 16:40, the storm surge hit. Water rose rapidly, 1 foot, 2 feet, 3 feet above normal sea level. The island disappeared beneath churning ocean. The shelter, built partially into the coral outcropping, was now completely submerged except for the highest point of its curved roof. Water poured through every seal. The drainage channel couldn't handle the volume. The shelter interior began flooding. Men scrambled to stay above water level, pressing against the curved roof where a narrow air pocket remained. "We're flooding," Lieutenant Hartley shouted. "We need to evacuate." "Evacuate to where?" Morrison shouted back. "Outside is worse. This shelter is holding. The water will recede." "How do you know?" "Because storm surge is temporary. It'll drop as quickly as it rose. We just have to survive the next 20 minutes. Those 20 minutes felt like hours. The water level inside the shelter rose to chest height before stabilizing. Men held onto the palm trunk supports, breathing the increasingly thin air in the pocket near the roof, listening to the storm rage outside, wondering if each crash they heard was the structure beginning to fail. At 16:58, a second anchor point failed. The shelter lurched violently. The fabric roof tore along one seam and rain poured through the opening. Morrison forced his way through the crowded shelter to the tier. He pulled an emergency repair kit from his pocket, patches and adhesive he'd brought from the PBY's survival gear, and began working in the dark by feel to seal the rip. "You can't patch that in these conditions," someone yelled. "Watch me." It took 3 minutes. The adhesive barely held in the wet conditions, but combined with the patch and pressure from the wind itself pushing the fabric against the support frame, it sealed enough to reduce the water intrusion. At 17:05, the storm surge began receding. Water levels dropped 3 feet to 2 feet to 1 foot. The shelter interior drained through Morrison's channel system. Men could stand again, breathe normally, and assess whether they were actually going to survive this. But the wind was still howling. The storm wasn't over. It was just giving them a brief respite before the next phase. At 17:30, the eye of the typhoon passed over them. Wind dropped to near calm. Rain stopped. The sudden quiet was eerie, like the storm had been a hallucination, and they'd imagined the terror of the past 90 minutes. Morrison knew better. This is temporary. The eye passes, the wind comes back from the opposite direction. We need to check anchors and reinforce before it hits again. "Are you insane?" Hartley asked. "We just survived the worst of it and you want to go outside." "The worst is still coming. The backside of the eye wall is usually stronger than the front. If our anchors are weakened, they'll fail when wind reverses direction. We have maybe 20 minutes to fix problems." Nobody wanted to leave the shelter, but Morrison was already opening the entrance hatch, crawling out into the temporary calm, assessing damage. The island was devastated. Palm trees were down. Debris was everywhere. The PBY was gone, torn from its moorings, probably sunk. The shelter had held barely, but 2 anchor points were failed and a third was frayed nearly to breaking. Morrison called for volunteers. 3 men crawled out, Danny Chen and 2 others. They worked frantically, re-rigging anchors using spare cable Morrison had stashed outside, reinforcing the weakest points, patching additional tiers in the fabric roof. They had 15 minutes before the wind returned. They used 12. At 17:47, Morrison shouted, "Everyone back inside, now." They scrambled into the shelter. Morrison sealed the entrance just as wind speeds jumped from 10 knots to 80 in seconds. The backside of the eye wall hit with even more violence than the front. But this time the shelter held without major failures. The reinforced anchors held. The patched fabric held. The drainage system, now cleared of debris, handled the second storm surge more effectively. By 1900, wind speeds were dropping. By 1930, the worst was over. By 2000, the typhoon had passed, leaving behind destruction, exhaustion, and 19 men who had survived, because an old mechanic had designed a shelter that looked stupid but functioned perfectly. When they finally emerged at 2015, the island was unrecognizable. Everything was gone: trees, vegetation, even portions of the coral had been scoured away. The PBY was nowhere to be seen. They were stranded, alive but stranded, on an island that now looked like the surface of the moon. Lieutenant Hartley turned to Morrison. "Your stupid plan worked." Morrison nodded tiredly. "Usually does. Stupid plans are just smart plans nobody else thought of yet." They'd survived the storm. Now they had to figure out how to survive being stranded behind enemy lines with no aircraft, limited supplies, and Japanese forces 12 miles away. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Tonight, 19 men huddled in a shelter built by a 42-year-old mechanic everyone had underestimated, grateful to be alive and beginning to understand that experience sometimes mattered more than youth when physics decided who lived and who died. Chapter 4, The Morning After. September 20, 1944, 6:30 hours. Morning revealed the full extent of the devastation. The island looked like it had been hit by artillery, stripped of vegetation, covered in debris, the coral foundation exposed and fractured. The lagoon, calm yesterday, was now churned muddy brown and littered with wreckage. Most importantly, the PBY Catalina was gone, not damaged, not salvageable, just gone, torn loose during the storm surge and either sunk in the lagoon or carried out to sea. With it went their primary means of rescue, most of their supplies, and any hope of immediate extraction. Lieutenant Hartley stood on the beach surveying the destruction, his expression somewhere between shock and despair. 19 men, his responsibility, were now stranded on a coral speck behind enemy lines with no aircraft, limited food and water, and Japanese forces close enough that they'd probably noticed the crashed Catalina or picked up distress signals. Morrison walked over, moving with the careful stiffness of someone whose 42-year-old body had been pushed beyond reasonable limits over the past 24 hours. "We need to inventory what we have," Morrison said. "What we have is nothing," Hartley replied. "The PBY's gone, supplies are gone, we're stuck. We have the shelter. We have tools I brought ashore. We have whatever survival gear the B-24 crew salvaged. And we have 19 men, most of whom are uninjured. And we're 40 miles behind enemy lines, with Japanese patrols 12 miles away." "Closer now," Morrison said quietly. "They'll have seen the storm. They'll send reconnaissance. We have maybe 24 hours before they find us." Hartley looked at him. "So what do we do? Your stupid plan got us through the typhoon. You got another stupid plan for surviving the Japanese." Morrison did, but it was so ridiculous that even he hesitated to say it out loud. "We salvage what's left of the Catalina and build a boat." Hartley stared at him. Build a boat, from airplane wreckage, to sail 40 miles through Japanese-patrolled waters. "Yes. That's insane. It's also our only option. We can't stay here. No food, no water, Japanese will find us. We can't swim 40 miles. So we build something that floats and sail home." "You're a mechanic, not a naval architect." "I'm a mechanic who grew up in Michigan building rowboats. I know how flotation works, how to distribute weight, how to improvise propulsion. It's not that different from building the storm shelter." The storm shelter was supposed to sit still and not collapse, A boat has to move. Everything moves if you push it right. For the next hour, Morrison and 3 others swam through the lagoon searching for Catalina wreckage. They found pieces, large sections of the hull's aluminum skin, chunks of the wing structure, fragments of the tail assembly. The majority of the aircraft had sunk in deep water, but enough remained in the shallow lagoon to work with. By 900, they'd hauled 7 large aluminum panels ashore, along with assorted cables, fabric sections, and structural tubing. Morrison laid everything out on the beach and started calculating. A boat for 19 men needed to be at least 20 feet long and 8 feet wide. It needed enough flotation to support approximately 3,500 pounds, 19 men plus supplies. It needed a hull shape that could handle open ocean conditions, and it needed propulsion, either sails or improvised oars. Morrison sketched a design, a catamaran using 2 aluminum pontoons made from curved Catalina hull sections, connected by a platform built from wing structure, with a crude mast and sail made from parachute fabric. It wouldn't be fast, it wouldn't be comfortable, but it might float and might be steerable. The younger men gathered around the sketch. Someone laughed. "That looks like something a kid would draw." "It is something a kid would draw," Morrison said. "Specifically me, age 12, when I built my first boat. It floated then. This'll float now. We don't have welding equipment to join the aluminum. We'll rivet it. We have the PBY's emergency rivet gun in the survival kit. We don't have sails. We have 3 parachutes from the B-24 crew. Parachute silk makes excellent sails. We don't have a mast. We have the PBY's radio antenna, aluminum tube, strong, 15 feet long, perfect mast." For every objection, Morrison had an answer, not because he was smarter than everyone else, but because he'd been solving mechanical problems for 40 years and understood that improvisation wasn't about having the right materials. It was about using whatever materials you had correctly. By 1000, construction began. Teams divided tasks. Some built pontoons, others fabricated the platform structure, others worked on sail and rigging. Morrison moved between groups, offering guidance, correcting mistakes, demonstrating techniques. The younger men, initially skeptical, began to see that Morrison's age wasn't a liability, it was an asset. He'd forgotten more about practical engineering than most of them had learned. Every problem had a solution if you thought creatively enough. At 1200, one of the B-24 crew members spotted something on the horizon, smoke. A ship, maybe 5 miles away, moving slowly. Japanese patrol boat, probably investigating storm damage or searching for downed aircraft. "We need to hide," Hartley said. "Hide where?" Morrison asked. "There's no vegetation left. They'll see us the moment they get close." "So what do we do?" "Finish the boat faster." They worked through the afternoon with desperate urgency. The pontoons took shape, curved aluminum panels riveted into semi-cylindrical forms, sealed with fabric patches where leaks appeared. The platform came together using wing spars as crossbeams. The mast was erected and a crude sail rigged from parachute silk. By 1600, they had something that looked vaguely boat-like. It was ugly, a Frankenstein's monster of aircraft parts held together with rivets, cable, and hope. But when they dragged it into the lagoon for testing, it floated. Not well, it wobbled, it leaked. The weight distribution was wrong, causing one pontoon to sit lower than the other, but it floated. Morrison spent the next hour adjusting ballast, redistributing weight, patching leaks. By 1700, the boat was stable enough to board. 19 men climbed aboard carefully, testing capacity. The pontoons sank lower but stayed afloat. The platform held their weight without buckling. "It works," Danny Chen said, sounding surprised. "Of course it works," Morrison replied. "Physics doesn't care if something looks stupid. It either floats or it doesn't." At 1730, the Japanese patrol boat appeared closer, now 3 miles away, definitely heading toward the island. They were out of time. "We launch now," Hartley said. "If we stay, they'll capture us." Morrison nodded. "Supplies aboard, everyone on. We sail west, stay low profile, hope they don't spot us in the failing light." The evacuation took 12 minutes. They loaded the last supplies, pushed the makeshift catamaran into deeper water, and started paddling with improvised oars while Morrison raised the parachute sail to catch the evening breeze. The boat moved. Slowly, clumsily, but it moved. They cleared the lagoon and entered open ocean just as the Japanese patrol boat reached the island. From 3 miles away, 19 men watched searchlights scan the beach, saw Japanese sailors disembark to investigate. The search would find the storm shelter, would realize people had been there recently. But with darkness falling and the ocean vast, finding a barely floating improvised boat would be nearly impossible. Morrison adjusted the sail to catch optimal wind. The catamaran picked up speed, maybe 3 knots, painfully slow but movement nonetheless. They were heading west, toward Allied-held territory 40 miles away. It would take all night, maybe longer. The boat leaked constantly, requiring 2 men to bail continuously. The sail threatened to tear in stronger gusts. The jury-rigged rigging creaked ominously. But they were moving, away from the enemy, toward safety, because a 42-year-old mechanic had built another stupid plan that somehow worked. Lieutenant Hartley sat next to Morrison near the mast. "If we survive this, I'm never calling you Pops again." "Sure you will," Morrison said. "Just make sure you mean it with respect instead of dismissal." "How'd you know this would work?" "I didn't, but I knew doing nothing definitely wouldn't work, so I did something. That's usually enough." They sailed through the night, betting their lives on a boat that looked like junk but floated like a miracle, guided by a mechanic who'd been underestimated for being old and proven that experience mattered more than youth when survival depended on knowing exactly how to make impossible things work. Chapter 5, The Crossing. The Pacific Ocean at night was vast, dark, and terrifying. The catamaran moved through water that looked black in all directions, lit only by stars and occasional phosphorescence from disturbed plankton. Every wave felt like it might capsize them. Every gust of wind seemed strong enough to tear the parachute sail. Every creak of the riveted aluminum pontoons sounded like imminent structural failure. But Morrison's design held. The catamaran's twin-hull configuration provided stability that a traditional boat would have lacked. The wide platform distributed weight evenly. The low profile reduced wind resistance. It was crude engineering, but it was sound engineering. The crew settled into shifts. 6 men belayed water continuously. The pontoons leaked through dozens of rivet holes that Morrison had tried to seal, but couldn't make perfectly watertight. 6 men paddled with improvised oars to supplement the sail. 4 men navigated using a compass salvaged from the PBY and dead reckoning based on stars. 3 men rested at any given time, though rest was relative when you were sitting on wet aluminum in darkness waiting for Japanese patrol boats to appear. Morrison stayed awake, monitoring the rigging, adjusting the sail, watching for structural problems. At 42, he should have been exhausted. Instead, adrenaline and purpose kept him sharp. This was what he did, kept things running when they wanted to fail, solved problems when problems arose, made sure 19 men made it home because that was the job, and he'd never failed to complete a job in 40 years of mechanical work. At 1:45, the first major crisis hit. A rivet failed on the starboard pontoon's forward seam. Water began flooding in faster than the bailers could handle. The pontoon started sinking, tilting the entire catamaran to starboard, threatening to capsize them. "We're sinking," someone yelled. Morrison was already moving toward the problem. He grabbed the emergency patching kit, fabric, adhesive, and thin aluminum strips he'd prepared for exactly this scenario. Working in darkness by feel, he identified the failed rivet hole, stuffed it with fabric, and secured a patch with aluminum strip, and what adhesive remained functional after being soaked in seawater. The patch held, barely. Water intrusion slowed to manageable levels. The pontoon stabilized. The catamaran leveled out. "How many more failures can we survive?" Hartley asked. "As many as we need to," Morrison replied. "We've got patches for 12 more rivet failures. If we exceed that, we improvise." At 3:20, the wind died completely. The parachute sail went slack. Forward momentum dropped to near zero. They